Hello and welcome to Cloudforest Vibes. My name's Bobby, and this is how I grow orchids and carnivorous plants. Hello and welcome to Cloudforest Vibes. So today, I don't know if you noticed or not, but in the back there we've got some holes where orchids should be. What I've done is I've pulled out all my Cattleya type orchids, and we're going to have a conversation about the differences in Cattleya care. I know that general Cattleya care is pretty well known throughout a lot of growers, but what's little known is that a lot of the species of Cattleyas actually grow quite differently than what you may assume. So today we're going to have a look, and we're going to talk about different types of Cattleyas and how they grow. So stay tuned and enjoy. I've got some stuff pulled out here. We're going to go ahead and we're going to start with the hybrids. Hybrids are very well known, and that's going to set the baseline for what I'm talking about what is typically assumed for Cattleya care. So on camera now are my three hybrid type Cattleyas. The top left orchid that we have right here is a Brassavola yellowbird. To the right, down one, this orchid right here is it was formerly known as a Brassavola maikai, but this has now been renamed, I believe, to a Brassanth maikai, and the variation of this is Louise. I have bloomed that one. That is my only Cattleya type in my whole collection that I've gotten to bloom. Very proud of it, and I will go ahead and throw up some pictures right now. And down a little further, we have another Brassavola. This is Brassavola Fuchs Star, and I got that orchid from Ecuagenera. I got this from a local orchid seller in Virginia, and I got this online from a seller in Florida. As you see, I grow all my Cattleyas mounted because I've had issues in my environment with my high humidity, with too much humidity and too much moisture to the roots, and them staying too wet for too long and rotting. Your typical Cattleya care states that your orchid roots do not want to stay wet for any substantial period of time. They do like to be moist, but they do not like to be wet, and for the most part you're going to always be told and always want to practice the rule where you always let these orchids dry completely out in between waterings, at least for a day or two, maybe even 3. They're typically pretty easy orchids to grow. The trickiest thing about Cattleyas is getting the light right. When I say getting the light right, what I mean is getting enough light to these plants to get them to produce a sheath and then to produce a flower. Most people will tell you that that is definitely the trickiest part about Cattleyas. Having that said, I do not grow most Cattleyas spectacularly. My main issue with growing hybrid Cattleyas, at least in my experience so far, and some of the other ones, is that I typically just do not get enough sunlight to keep these plants happy year-round. I get a few hours of sun through the window, but most of the light that these plants are provided is artificial high-power LED light. For one reason or another, I still haven't seemed to get it right. This one excluded. This one lives closest to the window, down where it gets nice sun in the morning and a lot of high-powered LED in the afternoon and evening time. And last year it did produce its first spike for me, which I'm still yet to cut off because I'm a lazy bone. But it has beautiful flowers again, and I have had no issues with this plant other than keeping it in the pot it came in for too long and losing all of its roots. When I did that, it actually split up into 3 pieces. I have this one hung on there, forgive me. 1, 2, 3 pieces. It dumped all of its roots. It stalled for about 6 or 8 months, and it is just now starting to produce a few new growths, 1, 2, and 3, 1 on each of the divisions, and I'm very hopeful for this thing to push on and recover in the next year or 2 and get back to the vigor and size that it was, because this really was a beautiful plant when I got it. Again, these plants I've had issues blooming. The BC Fuchs Star and the BL Yellowbird, and I don't know what to say because, as you see, I certainly don't have issues growing them. They have roots on top of roots on top of roots. All the growths that you see pushing up this way and all these new nubbins coming along all through this plant, here, 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 I have at least 5. They are all mine. So this plant has definitely doubled in size in the last year, year and a half since I've had it. I just can't seem to get the light right enough for it to bloom. This one as well, I have 2 directions of growth on this plant. One here and one here. I was actually growing it a little bit too moist. Oh, third, sorry, I have a 3rd direction of growth from the bottom. I had a 4th here, believe it or not, when I first had it, but I grew it too moist and I rotted that right off. So I've had some issues growing these with my light conditions, but I am very hopeful for this season to have had some sort of a change. I grow these in intermediate to warm conditions. That's high 50s in the winter time as a low, and anywhere from low to mid 70s during the day. And in the summertime it gets a high of around 80 to 83 max degrees, and a low in the evening time around 66 or 67 to 68 degrees. I water them every several days. Like I said, once I've noticed that the roots in the media have completely dried out, I fertilize them with MSU most of the year at 150 to 200 parts per million. I also supplement them with calcium nitrate during the summer months when they're in heavy growth, or whenever they are in heavy growth, and CalMag and KelpMax. I typically feed all of those at around 30 to 60 parts per million, depending on what the orchid's doing and what the orchid needs. I will mix some of them in with their feed when they're in heavy growth to save time, so I'm not dosing a bunch of supplements. I like to get it all done at once, but when I'm mixing them together, I tend to keep my ppm numbers lower than when I'm feeding them separately and on their own. Humidity levels in my tank are 80% to 86%, and they typically don't seem to mind, again, as long as you grow them where their roots have access to air and have the ability to dry out every several days. So having that said, again, pots are out of the question for me. They will work good in pots if you grow them on a windowsill or if you have a drier setup than mine, but being that my air humidity is so high, I really have a lot of issues growing in pots, especially with plants that want to or need to dry out quickly in between waterings. So this is getting kind of monotonous, it feels to me, because Cattleya care, the general Cattleya care, pretty much everyone knows it. That is not the whole purpose of this video, really. This is the last thing I really want to talk about, but I figured it would give us a good start and a good baseline to what everybody understands typically about growing Cattleyas. My favorite Cattleyas in my collection are my Cattleya species, and I have a pretty good variety at this point of Cattleya species, most of which coming from Brazil, and I'm going to have a quick discussion with you guys about those because you can basically take most of what you know about these and pitch it right out the window when it comes to a lot of the species Cattleyas. These are really interesting orchids, really fun orchids to grow, but there's just nothing like the species and nothing like really figuring out what these plants want and what they need to be happy and to survive. So let's look at the rest of the Cattleyas in my collection and have a discussion about how different Cattleya care can be from your typical standards and what you guys might know about Cattleyas. Okay, so we're back here. I have all my Cattleyas here on my watering rack, kind of split up into their respective sections. Right here I have 2 Brassavolas, here I have 4 Laelias, and here I have 3 Sophronitis. Some of these have been reclassified into just the general Cattleya alliance or Cattleya genus. However, in this grow room and the way that I purchased them, their names are going to remain the same because, like Roger always says and like a lot of other growers know, the names beforehand were very important into being able to distinguish different types of care and how to look after these orchids. For instance, if you wanted to look after this orchid the same way as this orchid, surely enough, one of those orchids is going to die. What I mean by that specifically, more than anything else, is the watering schedules. I know you've always learned and been told that Cattleyas need to dry out in between waterings. I'm here to tell you firsthand That is absolutely not true with all Cattleyas. Most Cattleyas, yes, do not want to have their roots smothered, they do not want to stay wet at all times, they do not want to stay soggy. However, there are plenty of Cattleya species specifically that want to be moist at all times. I have several here on the right side that fit that bill and fit that category perfectly. The two plants I have here on the left, the Brassavolas, they tend to grow under what you would consider more traditional Cattleya care. They grow a bit drier, they must dry out between waterings, and they like a lot of air to their roots. You'll notice this one came to me mounted on a stick with bare roots for the most part, and just a little tiny patch of moss that dries out basically every day. This one I've remounted on cork bark with literally 2 small flecks of moss, more or less bare on there, and it just kind of goes. I'm still recovering this one, but it does have a pretty nice new growth for this plant on here at this time. These two plants are Laelias, and these are a little bit special because these plants really do like a dry cycle. However, this one does like to grow quite a bit more moist. These two Laelias, however, grow quite differently. These like to stay moist at all times. Now you'll notice I do not have a lot of moss on here. You can see the roots, just like with this one. This is mounted on a stick. Most of the roots are growing exposed, but there is moss, live moss and everything growing on this mount, so you know it stays moist. The reason that their care is so different from other Cattleyas is that specifically they grow farther down in the canopy, farther down in the trees. They get a lot much more shade than a lot of your other Cattleya types that grow way high up in the canopy or the emergent layer and get full sun at all times. These 3 plants over here are Sophronitis, and these are also much more moist growing than a lot of your other Cattleya types. Having that said, you basically run the gambit of care when it comes to a watering cycle for all of these plants. So what we're going to do now is we're going to dive in just a little bit deeper at an individual plant level and talk a little bit more about the care for these types of orchids. So the first 2 plants that we're going to discuss are the 2 Brassavolas. This is Brassavola regina, and this is Brassavola subulifolia. I have not been successful at blooming these yet. In fact, I've very much struggled to grow this plant. But this one grows rather well for me. It's got 2 directions of growth on it at this time, and 2 new growths that have pushed on. And this one here has 1 growth after a long battle of dying the last almost 2 years. And it is finally doing what it's supposed to be doing. This has some red marking here, and supposedly that's a sign that it's getting enough light. So I'm very hopeful for this plant's future. Hopefully in the next year or maybe 2, this will push on enough to be healthy and happy, and we can maybe see some blooms. This plant as well, I've got this in one of the brightest spots it can possibly be in my grow area, and it seems to be growing really well. It seems to be growing happy. Most of the year I'm feeding these orchids MSU fertilizer between 150 and 200 parts per million. So being that these are pretty much under the basic Cattleya care and everything like that, basic feeding and all that, we're going to go ahead and move on to our next plants because that's really the focus. That's really why we're here. So here we have our 3 Sophronitis. This is Sophronitis manticulae, this is Sophronitis cernua, and this here is Sophronitis pygmaea. Again, these are under the Cattleya Alliance, and a lot of these, actually I believe all of these, have been renamed to just Cattleya manticulae, Cattleya cernua, and Cattleya pygmaea. I guess that's not too big of a deal as far as that goes, but as far as care tips it might, because these orchids, unlike the last bunch we've looked at, they are the start of what like to grow a lot more moist than typical Cattleyas. You can see, especially with this one, that there's live moss growing all over this mount. This is nice and algae filled. This one's nice and green with live moss and some algae growing. And they really do not like to ever dry out crispy dry like a lot of your other Cattleyas would. I water these every day. If I come in and I do feel that they're moist, I may skip a day until the next day, but I never let them get crispy dry for more than really a few hours or a day at most. This one waters every day regardless, because this plant does not like to ever dry out. If you grow the species, it likes air to the roots But again, it's tricky because it wants to stay moist. Most Sophronitis, excluding this one, come from a higher elevation. They are classified as cooler growers, but you can grow them intermediate as long as you keep a very high humidity, and you keep in mind that if these plants get too dry for too long, you will most likely lose them. So far, I feed them all the same and I'm not having any issues. As a matter of fact, quite the opposite. They're growing quite strong. This new growth is pushing on. This one is producing a new growth down here. Very small, very hard to see, but you'll just have to take my word for it. And my Sophronitis cernua has produced its first mature looking growth and has 5 or 6 new growths coming on throughout the plant, and it's doing quite well. I feed these plants every other time that I water them. They are, I would consider to be pretty high feeders, especially this little tyke right here. They love, love, love to eat. I give them frequent calcium nitrate, and I give them kelp once every week or so. It helps with the moss, it helps with the overall growth of the plant, and they really do seem to enjoy it. They are pretty easy to grow. They don't need quite as much light as other Cattleyas to be happy. You really don't need to get all the full sun that you would with a typical Cattleya when you have a Sophronitis. A lot of them have brilliant, beautiful red flowers. There are other variations with yellow flowers and so on and so forth, but that's one of the most striking things, and some of the flowers, for the size of the plant, can be relatively large. Again, they get the same conditions that all my other orchids get, the same temperatures, 57 lows in the winter to around mid-70 highs, and then low 80s high in the summer down to around 67 or 68 degrees at night. And so far, they're doing just fine. I haven't had these two very long, but I can tell you right now, the way that they're growing, they are at least happy for now. I'll have to monitor them through the summer. Worst case scenario, maybe they go in the small tank, but they will have to get remounted to go in there because I do not trust what's on that mount going into my little orchidarium. Anyhow, that's the end of this little section. We're going to go ahead and pull out the Laelias, and we'll have a little bit better of a conversation about them and their vast differences. So our final group that we're going to discuss today is my Laelias. This is Laelia pumila, this is Laelia diana, this is Laelia lilliputana, and this here is Laelia harpophylla. These are all species Laelias that grow very differently from one another. This here grows more like a Sophronitis, where it doesn't necessarily ever want to dry out completely, although it does not want to stay soggy at all times. I water this plant every day. I let it dry, at least the aerial roots, completely, and this bottom portion with the small bit of moss gently in between waterings. And in the winter time, I do give it a rest. I forgot to mention before, all the Sophronitis except for the Pygmaea get somewhat of a dry winter rest period. That is very important to some of these orchids here as well. This plant is known as a rapiculus Laelia, and a lot of those grow super dry. This, however, if you look at orchidspecies.com, is a bit different. It does like a little bit more moisture. However, again, if you smother the roots of this plant, it will die. This plant is special right now because this big new growth right here has a big sheath pushing up inside. This is my first species Cattleya to get to sheath. I have this growing in a very bright location, although this is another one of those orchids, all of these for that matter, that do not need that full day sun, that crazy sun to be happy and survive. Laelia lilliputana grows on rocky outcrops, underneath rock ledges, and at the base of certain shrubs and trees in an area of Brazil that doesn't get a whole lot of water all the time. So this plant has a nice quick wet-dry cycle. I spray it every morning. It's dry by midday, and that's kind of what it gets. So far it's happy. I would love to find a piece of granite or limestone to put this thing on, but right now it's happy on the cork. It's pushing up new growth, and again, doing really well in my environment. This is one of my newer plants, Laelia diana. It did come to me in growth, so we're tracking this. I'm waiting to see the beginnings of new roots so I can get it off of this stick and onto a nice piece of cork just like this plant's next to it. Now, you'll notice again, this plant has live moss growing all over it. This is one of those Laelias that is listed as a moist-loving Laelia. It's an intermediate warm grower. All of these plants are from Brazil, and it's another one of those Laelias that grows lower down in the trees, lower down in the forest, and really doesn't need full sun all day, bright light like other Laelias and other Cattleya types. This is happy with very bright shade or very, very bright indirect or filtered light, and it's going to grow just fine for you. Again, I recently got this plant, and I'm hoping that this new growth pushes on and is happy enough to bloom in my conditions. The last Laelia we're going to discuss is this Laelia pumila. This is another plant that grows low down in the forest in really humid and really moist jungle areas. This plant actually has 2 new growths coming on. I've remounted it recently on this piece of cork with some moss, and I never let this plant dry out. It stays moist at all times. I let the moss get a little bit spongy and almost dry feeling to the touch before I water it, but again, it has been thriving. It's pushing out new roots all over the place, new growths, and this is another one that doesn't need a whole bunch of sun to be happy and grows rather moist. So I know this was quick again, but I just wanted to touch on how different care can be for some Cattleya types. I do want to make a little bit more in-depth videos, but I think what I'll do is I'll just do spotlight videos on most of these plants as they progress, and we'll see just how they grow and learn more about them on an individual basis. But those are the 3 different types of Cattleyas, at least the way I section them off, to be watered, to be cared for. And I hope this helps some of you guys figure out why maybe you have trouble with some, or why if you have some of the hybrids that potentially have any of these species in it, why they may be a little more finicky or tougher to take care of than some of your other ones. I did totally forget to talk about care for these orchids, for feeding and stuff. Anyhow, if you haven't caught on by now, all my Cattleyas really get the same feed. They get 150 to 200 parts per million, MSU or JAX, and I do supplement all of them with CalMag year-round, kelp year-round, and calcium nitrate when they're in the growing season or heavily in growth. I water these twice a week. I feed these about twice a week in growth, once a week usually in the winter. Another important thing is to make sure if you're going to go into species of any orchids, but especially Cattleyas or something like that, that you're going to want to make sure you look it up and do your research and make sure you're not going to end up with something that you assume is a dry grower and ends up being something like this that comes from a very moist, humid, swampy area and will certainly not do well in a very dry or very arid environment. So I've got all my Cattleya types back in their respective places, and I figured I'd just give you a quick look at them. Most of them grow basically top shelf or very high up in a line towards the window. They get sun from the window again, like I said, in the mornings. They live near my Telumnias and some of my other plants that really like to get a lot of light. And again, they stay pretty happy. I hope you can hear me okay. My extractor fan has been on for the last couple days because it's in the 90s outside and I just can't seem to keep it cool enough in here. So it's about 80 degrees in here right now, nice and toasty. I think it's 78 degrees in here right now. So anyhow, I'm going to go ahead and sign this video off so I can get this closed up and keep all my wonderful humidity in here. But I hope you guys really enjoyed. I hope you learned something. please again feel free to ask me any questions. I love answering questions and chatting about these plants, and I will do a bit more in-depth look at some of these later on, but I wanted to go through real quick and give you guys a quick overview of the Cattleyas that I grow and a quick chat about how different some of the care can be if you're not careful, especially once you're getting into some of these species. So thanks again for joining. I hope you guys are all staying safe out there, and until next time, happy growing.